Well, first of all, can I thank you very much for coming? Secondly, can everybody hear? Anyone can't hear, please indicate. Despite the hype about being an audience and a roadshow, this is really a public discussion. I talk for a bit, then there'll be an interval, then we're going to have questions, which is the bit I enjoy most. And I'm not asking you to vote for me, which is a great relief for me, and also I hope for you. But the point really that I feel very, very strongly about is that politics ought to be brought back to where we live and shouldn't be confined simply to watching the House of Commons on Prime Minister's questions or seeing the media present politics in the way they want to present it. I think both are a bit of a distortion. I don't know if you do watch Prime Minister's questions, but there's a lot of knockabout between the Prime Minister of the day, whoever it happens to be, and the Leader of the Opposition. And then you get these very, very loyal Labour backbench members, you know the ones I mean, who don't ask a question at all. They get up and say, could I trouble my right honourable friend to remind us of his latest triumph since last Wednesday? As somebody said, there are so many planted questions, it ought really to be known as gardener's question time. And then in the evening, you have a punch-up to amuse Jeremy Paxman between two people, neither of whom are given long enough to say what they really want to say before the argument begins. And I don't think that is a very satisfactory way of discussing some really, really difficult problems. I was thinking of what they were. If you take one very obvious problem, the question of pensions. There are a lot of people who thought their pensions were secure, and now because of the fall in the stock market, they discovered that the companies with which they'd insured can't deliver what they were promised. I think Equitable Life, I read, had cut the pensions by 15% because the money wasn't in the bank to pay. Or if you take state pensioners, years ago when Barbara Castle was the minister, and I was in the cabinet when she was there, the state pension was linked to earnings. What Barbara said, and I thought it was very sensible, since the wealth we enjoy was earned by the people who've now retired, they were entitled, when they retired, to a share in the increase of the national income. And that was done, that was dropped, and that cost the average pensioner £30 a week. And I think Barbara's last speech before she died at the conference a couple of years ago, if I remember her rightly, said by the year 2020, the state pension would only be 9% of average earnings. So, in effect, older people could face life in poverty. That's one problem. Or if you take the other end of the scale, if you take young people who go to college, they now have to take out a loan to go to college. When I was at college after the war, I'd been a pilot in the RAF, they gave me a free college education. We were absolutely bankrupt, but at the same time we thought it important that education should be available. Now, the average student when they leave college has a debt of £12,500, and if there are these top-up fees, could be a great deal more than that. Marry another student, which is what I did, that's a debt of £25,000. Take out a mortgage and try and get a house, and in London the average house now costs £250,000. The average house costs that. I don't know what, £50,000, £60,000 for a mortgage. Add to that, you've got a start life with a debt of about £80,000. Now, I think that's absolutely wrong. I'll be honest with you, I've got 10 grandchildren, so I have an interest in saying it. 2 of them already at college. But you see, when you pay back your loan, you're really being taxed because you're educated. And I have a very simple principle: you should be taxed if you're rich, not because you're educated. And also, the education of everybody benefits everybody. And my doctor's a very nice woman, happens to be from Chesterfield, though she lives in London. When I go and see my doctor, I benefit by her medical education. If she makes $1 million, which she won't as a general practitioner in the NHS, tax her. But don't tax her, as it were, because she'd given up years when she might have been earning to do her medical training. So there's a lot of anxiety about that. There's a lot of anxiety also about the environment. I think people are beginning to realize that if we get this wrong, the whole human race could be threatened by some environmental disaster. It's a difficult thing, that one, to think about, because even if we're all very conscientious and recycle our paper and put it out to be collected and recycled, that isn't enough to solve the problem. And I read the other day that by the middle of this century it was possible that the cost of environmental disasters would exceed the total national output of the world, or global output of the world. So that's a problem. And then people are worried about war and so on. Really big questions. And I don't really feel that the way these matters are discussed takes full account of our own contribution. If you watch the telly, you hear somebody making a speech. I'm not making a point about any particular leader, but they all now have a script writer, spin doctor, and you watch them on the telly, and they may not really be talking to you or to us. They may be trying to restore confidence in the British economy in Wall Street or something, and you can't answer any questions, ask any questions anyway. So there is a separation between what is called the political process and people's concerns. Now, I think there are 800 people in the hall tonight. And if the average age is 40, and I don't know whether I'm right, that would be 32,000 years of experience in the Dorking halls tonight. And if you're all my age, that would be 64,000 years of experience. And as I get older, I'm 78 next, I realize that my own opinions have been shaped by my experience. I mean, you can read books and go to college and get degrees, that can be done, but it's what actually happens to you when you think about it that leads you to the conclusions you have. And certainly all my political ideas came from that. I was born in a very political family. Of course, my dad was a Labour MP, and so from the time I was very, very young, I remember it. I went out when I was a 10-year-old and campaigned or distributing literature in the 1935 election, as one example. And I still keep everything I ever got. I still got the literature I distributed. And one thing I distributed had been issued by the Miners' Federation of Great Britain. That was the NUM of years ago. And what it said on it was this: between 1926, which was the end of the general strike, and 1935, in 9 years, 1 million miners were injured and 7,800 miners were killed in the pits. Now that registered in my mind. And when later I became a Member of Parliament for Chesterfield, the mining area, and the miners' strike began, I gave them 100% support. I mean, that wasn't based on reading left-wing things when I was a student. It was based on what I knew, and of course, when I got to know the miners very, very well, it was obvious their whole economy was being destroyed, their lives, their communities, their families were being destroyed. I'll give you another example, and I'm speaking now simply about myself. In 1939, I heard Neville Chamberlain announce in a broadcast that we were at war, and I lived in London during the Blitz, and every night we went down from my home down to the shelter, slept on the concrete floor, and one morning I came up, 500 people had been killed in the locality where I lived, and saw London, East London burning. And I don't want war. And I think people who've experienced war are probably the ones who are most doubtful about it, because you see what terrible suffering it costs. My brother was killed, many of my friends were killed. And so that shaped my thinking. Our house caught fire, and so I have a very special reason for thinking the firefighters should be treated decently. And well, thank you. I was at a fire station yesterday, and I met some of the firemen, and one of them said, of course, a mate of mine has to come from Nottingham every day, each week, because he can't afford to live in London. So he comes to Nottingham for 4 days, sleeps on a concrete floor, as I did in the Blitz, goes back for the weekend. And I was at another fire station today, because I think, given what they do for us, we ought to do something for them. And I said, what happens if the army come and they try to use the appliances you have? Oh, they said they can't. So I said, why? Oh, and they pointed to the fire engine and said, they were all sold off by the government last year for £45 million to a private company. So they've been privatised. So it's not our consent needed to use the fire appliances. They've got to negotiate it with the private company. And they said, not only did they sell them for 45 million, but that company sold them on to somebody else. So all of a sudden, arguments which you might think were very theoretical become very practical. And you think about them. And I suppose if you're in politics, and I have been for a very long time, 51 years in Parliament, you ask yourself very simple questions. I think that there are three basic questions, whether you're talking about a personal case or world situation. The first question is, what is going on? And that's not always a very easy thing to find out. Secondly, why is it going on? And that's sometimes more difficult. And the third question is the hardest of all: what do you do about it? If somebody came to my surgery and 1,000 people a year used to come for advice, some would say, I'm homeless, Tony. Why? Well, I split up from my husband or repossessed, whatever. What can I do about it? Well, I could write to the housing manager and say, this woman and her children are homeless, can you help, or whatever. But if you look at big questions like the situation in the Middle East now, what's going on? Well, there are a lot of interpretations about what is going on. Is it that Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction? Is it that the Americans want the oil? What is the reason? And then what could you do about it? Well, it's very difficult to find an immediate answer, but you probably have to reach some conclusion of your own. And for me, at any rate, because I'm not at all cynical about politics, I know people say they're all the same, they're all corrupt. I don't believe a word of it. For me, the essence of being a member of Parliament, and indeed of the whole democratic process, is very simply, it's this. When I was in Chesterfield, which I represented, everyone in that town employed me. The bus driver, the street sweeper, the home help, the district nurse, the doctor, the lawyer employed me. I was free to say what I liked, and I did, and they were free to get rid of me. And that is an umbilical link, really, between a representative and their constituents. And I think really that, it may sound negative, but I think that is really what democracy is about. I worked out once 5 basic democratic questions. If you meet a powerful person, ask them 5 questions. What power have you got? Where did you get it from? In whose interest you exercise it? To whom are you accountable? And how can we get rid of you? Now that is the democratic question, because if you can't get rid of the people who govern you, they may be brilliant, they may be talented, they may have lots of degrees, but they don't have to listen to you. And I feel on polling day, quite emotional about it, because you see some old lady coming in on crutches, and she goes to the, that wooden box where you vote, and she's given a pencil on a bit of string, and she puts a cross on a piece of paper, and she could get rid of a government without killing anyone. Now, there are many people in the world who would give their life to get rid of the people who govern them, but in this country, it's possible to do it that way, and it's very nice, particularly if you're a member of the government she's decided to get rid of, because the process takes place peacefully. And that is something we have somehow to restore. We have somehow to give people confidence in the ability to do something about it. And I guess, I don't know whether you'd agree with me, that nowadays a lot of people feel that they're not being represented, but they're being managed. When you vote for a member of Parliament, you expect him to argue for you. I mean, whether I agreed with people or not, if an issue came up in my constituency, I'd push it forward, argue, write to the minister, go and see the minister, put down a parliamentary question, try and get it away. That's what you're about. And now people feel increasingly they're being controlled. And that, I think, is very dangerous, because don't tell me people aren't interested in politics. They're tremendously interested in politics. I mean, the pensioners are really up in arms about the thing I was talking about. Students are very worried. The environmentalists, there were 1 million people in Florence last week, the so-called European Social Forum, arguing about what sort of Europe that perhaps gives them rather greater control, or gives us greater control of how it's run. And this is an interest in politics, but it isn't channeled through, as it should be, the normal democratic structures which we have. So that is why, as I mentioned, one reason why I'm very, very keen we should get some serious discussions going, with an opportunity to hear an argument and then have some opportunity to discuss it. Now, I think one of the reasons why people feel there's not much they can do is because they realize now that power doesn't actually exist in Parliament or the government they elect. I mean, that's always been true. Years ago, of course, the Parliament wasn't elected anyway, and all the power rested with invaders like Julius Caesar or William the Conqueror or the landowners or whatever, and therefore there was no democratic counter-pressure whatsoever. Then we had the struggle for the vote, which extended it, and so on. But now, if you look at the world, the power is very largely vested in enormous multinational companies that are so big and rich and powerful that they are bigger than nation states. And may have been difficult to deal with the landlord if you were a serf. But I remember when Henry Ford's grandson came to see me, also called Henry Ford, when I was Secretary of State for Industry, he marched into my office like an emperor addressing a parish councillor. You know, if you don't do what Ford Motor Company wants you to do, I can't guarantee we shall maintain the production of cars in Britain. That was real power. And don't ever underestimate the power that big companies have on government policy. They have enormous power. And of course, they are not fools. They also know that another way of getting political power, other than bullying governments, is to try to set up organizations that become part of the structure of what you might call a new world order, the World Trade Organization, for example, not elected by anybody, not accountable to anybody, but the World Trade Organization is now engaged in trying to get the privatization of public services. The argument they use is we have free competition, what's wrong? The real motive for it is that the budgets in health and education worldwide are in billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars and pounds and rubles and euros and so on and so on, and they want to get control of it, which I think is one reason why the fire brigade in those fire appliances I mentioned in London have been sold off. And that is real power. And and then there's the International Monetary Fund. Again, enormous power it has. I remember in 1976 when the IMF told us we had to make huge cuts in public expenditure. It turned out it wasn't necessary, but we made them and triggered off a lot of the disputes in the public services in the winter of 1978. And so big business doesn't just operate as individual companies, it operates through these organizations. But also they know there's another way of having power, which was explained to me very simply by an old friend of mine who was a former Democratic governor of Ohio, my wife's home state in America, Jack Gilligan. I've known him for years, and last time I saw him, he said to me, "Tony, there'll never be democracy in America when big business buys both political parties and expects a payoff whichever one wins." And you know, that's happening here too. If you make huge contributions to a political party, then it'll be easier to get a hearing at the White House or number 10. And that is quite a serious problem, I think, for those who think when they elect somebody, oh, well, they'll be deciding things. I'm not sure it's quite as simple as that. Now, another group of people who have power, and this might have been a difficult thing to explain a few years ago, but I think everyone understands it now, is the power of religion. I suppose when President Bush said that he was engaged in a crusade, that brought it home. I don't think he'd heard about the Crusades, or he wouldn't have said it. It was a very silly thing to say, because during the Crusades, of course, the Christian soldiers went to Palestine and slaughtered the Muslims and slaughtered the Jews in their thousands, and of course they remember it there, but it isn't included in the national curriculum here, or probably in America. But the power of religion is very great, because just as I mentioned that money gave power, and power makes it easy to get money, religious leaders could use religion to control people, and they do. And if you take the Muslim world, they're very conscious of Islam. And of course, in order to justify what they do, they say God is on our side. And they have called a jihad, a holy war. And the holy war means that if you fight the infidel, God thanks you for it and maybe gives you some reward in heaven. We don't have a jihad, but we have a very similar thing. We pull out a bishop who will appear on the telly and say it's a just war. But a just war, like a holy war, is a way of telling you God is approving of killing other people. And the problem about religious conflict is that you can't resolve it by compromise. If there's an argument about a frontier between one country and another, you can sit round the table and redraw the frontier. You can't redraw the frontier between Christianity and Islam, as it were. And so that is, gives an added dimension to the danger of war. And I think that we have to be careful. Henry VIII, of course, realized the power of the church. So he nationalized it. The Church of England is our oldest nationalized industry, as you probably know. And the reason that Henry VIII nationalized the Church of England was because he thought all the priests were loyal to the Pope and not to him. So by nationalising the Church of England, he had a priest in every parish, in every pulpit every Sunday, telling you God wanted you to do what the king wanted you to do, which if you're king is a very sensible thing to do, because the church was the medieval media. Now you may think this is a bit of ancient history, but ask yourself this: who appointed the new Archbishop of Canterbury? The Prime Minister. Why? Because the power of appointment of the archbishops belongs to the Queen, and the Queen doesn't have any power. It's all done by the Prime Minister. So the Prime Minister of Britain doesn't have to be an Anglican, doesn't have to be a Christian, could be a Muslim, could be a Jew, could be an atheist, but he still appoints the Archbishop of Canterbury. And that is a survival of a very important development. So we somehow have to find a way of dealing with this question of religion in international controversy. Mind you, having said that, I think, I've thought about it a bit, that the most powerful religion in the world, more powerful than Judaism, Christianity, Islam, or Hinduism, is the people who worship money. And I tell you why I say it, because if you listen to the news on the hour, every hour they give you the business news. They tell you what's happened to the FTSE, whatever that may be. And there's Mr. Dow Jones, who works 24 hours a day doing averages. And I've never met any old-age pensioner who hears the news, the business news, and rushes out and sells his euros and buys dollars. And the thing about the business news is there's nothing you can do about it. I mean, presumably if you work in the City of London, which I don't, you'll have your computer, your laptop, your pager, telling you the movement of currencies every minute. But, you see, why don't they broadcast on the hour information that's relevant to people? For example, how many people are unemployed on the hour? How many people are homeless? How many people have died of asbestosis? How many people who can't live on the pension? How many people are waiting for hip operations? That would be quite relevant. But you can't write to your local MPs, I'm never voting for you because the FTSE's fallen down. But you might say, I'm not voting for you unless you do something about unemployment. And if I had any musical talent, which I haven't, I would draft a hymn to the business news. And the Dow Jones average fell 3 points tonight. It would have a sort of religious flavour to it. And I think about this because at my age, you see, you have to think what you do. I should have mentioned this earlier. I mentioned I was 78 next. And what do old men do? Old men always talking about the past are boring. Old men always whinging about the present are intolerable. Old men who try to run anything are absolute bloody menace. So when you get to my age, your job is to try to understand and encourage people. I remember when I was young, you know, the 80 and 90-year-old MPs patted me on the shoulder, Noel, Baker, Fenner, Brockway, they said, Tony, you haven't quite got it right, but keep on at it. And you remember teachers for the same reason, because they encourage you. So the function is to encourage people, but also, above all, to understand. And I was thinking to myself, if the worship of money is a religion, then who are the priests? And I don't know if you'll agree with me, but I came to the conclusion that they were the management consultants. I hope I'm not giving offence. The reason I say this is because I had a letter through the letterbox the other day about, and I don't know who wrote it, but it sums up what I was thinking. It was about a boat race between the BBC and a Japanese crew at a time when John Burt ran the BBC. And, you know, he was a brilliant manager. I didn't think much of his broadcasting, but he was a marvellous manager. And both sides, the BBC and the Japanese crew, practiced long and hard, and the Japanese won by a mile. So what Burt did, as any manager would, when faced with a problem of that kind, he set up a working party to find out why. And the working party discovered the Japanese had 8 people rowing and 1 steering, and the BBC had 8 people steering and 1 rowing. So, absolutely. So Burt, being on top of his job, employed management consultants. And 18 months later, after a cost of $1.5 million, the management consultants confirmed the diagnosis of the working party and suggested the BBC crew be completely restructured along the following lines: 3 assistant steering managers, 3 deputy steering managers, a director of steering services, and the rower be given an incentive to row harder. So they had another race, And this time they lost by 2 miles, so Bert laid off the rower for poor performance, and he sold the boat and used it for a higher-than-average pay award for the Director of Steering Services. Now, I know it's a bit of a cartoon, but it does confirm the idea there are lots of people with objectives and league tables and mission statements and so on, but do we not possibly have too many chiefs and not enough Indians, if you know what that phrase is? So money is very, faith in whatever it is very important. Now there's another group of people who obviously have power, and those are the people who have knowledge. If you know more than somebody else, you've got an advantage over them. And this touches on so many things. First of all, touches on education. I mean, I'll be honest with you, I think the purpose of education is to discover the genius inside everybody and develop it. I don't believe in all this idea that you're only trying to find specially gifted people to run the world and shunt the rest off into the labour market to take orders. But then, like everybody in Britain, I happen to have specially gifted children. It's completely coincidence. And they ring me up, Dad, and they say, Dad, you won't believe it, but all our children are specially gifted. And when I was in Moscow, I discovered the Russians, communist Russia, had schools for specially gifted children. So I raised it with the minister, Mr. Strokin, in the Kremlin. And he gave me a big wink, and he said, actually, they're for the children of specially gifted parents. And that somehow seemed to sum it all up. But anyway, that's one side of it. Now, the other side of information and knowledge is the media. Because if you listen to John Humphreys in the morning on the Today programme, and you listen to Nick Clark on The World at One, and you listen to Jeremy Paxman on Newsnight, you have all the information necessary to give proper support for what the British establishment wants you to think anyway. That is what it is about. I'm not criticising it, but they don't take a lot of interest in dissenting views. And this made me think, now why don't they do it? Because when I look at history, it seems to be all really good ideas bubble up from underneath, and finally they get through to the top. Did I sometimes think that when anyone has a really good idea, to begin with it's ignored, and then if you go on, you're stark staring bonkers. They've said that to me about one or two things I've argued for. Beyond that, you're very, very dangerous. Then there's a pause. Then you can't find anyone at the top who doesn't claim to have thought of it in the first place. That is how progress is made. But the neglecting of things that don't interest them is part of the process. Last year, I was out with Jack Jones. Jack is 90 now. He was, you remember, his trade union leader, Transport and General Workers Union. And he's now the president of the National Pensioners Convention. And we had a demonstration in Blackpool. There were 2,000 of us going along the front, and there are 11 million pensioners. So we're quite a substantial body of opinion. And as we marched along the front, I said to Jack, you realise, don't you, Jack, that there won't be a word of this on the media unless you take this brick and throw it through McDonald's. And if you do, there'll be a bishop on Newsnight talking about the rising tide of violence among old people. And at least they'll bloody well discuss the problem. And of course, he didn't throw the brick, and there wasn't a word on the media. And it does matter, the media, because I think progress can really almost be measured in how long it takes a message at the bottom to get to the people at the top. The conclusion I came to some time ago was Parliament is the last place to get the message. When Parliament decides something, you can be sure that the generality of people had probably decided it in their own mind some years before. And if you don't have a fairly good flow from the bottom to the top, then some people, in frustration, take to violence, and that is not the right way to solve problems. So there's a case, a very strong case for trying to get the messages through, and the media have some role in it. Now then, of course, there are other people who are interested in information, and that's the government. The government do it in a number of ways. First of all, they have what's called the 30-year rule, under which it is illegal for anyone to know what goes on in government until 30 years have passed. So I'll be 107 before I know what's really being discussed in Whitehall between the Prime Minister and Gordon Brown and about the Iraqi war or whatever. And the 30-year rule is designed to keep us in ignorance of what the government's doing. But, of course, the government are very interested in what we're doing. That's why they bug everybody's telephone. I mean, I was Postmaster General 40 years ago, and I wondered why our second oldest nationalised industry was the post office, nationalised by Charles II. I thought, was he an early socialist who'd never been recognised? Why did he do it? Because you did, the Royal Mail was set up in 1660. And I discovered why Charles II set up the Royal Mail, because he wanted to open everybody's letters. The only way you could open everybody's letters by having the Royal Mail. So the post office was the birth of MI5. And now they bug your emails and your telephones and all the rest of it. But it does give you an idea. The government's control idea of information is to pump out through the spin doctors what they want you to know, to keep secret what you might like to know, and to find out what you know in case it might be a threat to them. I mean, it's open government is the heart of democracy. I forget who said it, but I think he said openness is the best disinfectant, and so indeed it is. So that's another source of power. Then we come to the question of technology. Now, I was thinking of my mum, who was born in 1897. Lovely woman, died about 11 years ago. And the reason I thought of her was the changes that had occurred in her lifetime, because when she was born in 1897, the fastest vehicle was a train, 60 miles an hour. When she died, a spacecraft could go at 25,000 miles an hour. When she was born, the largest number of calculations you could make was with the beads on a board, you know, the abacus. And now, of course, computers, when she died, computers can do millions of calculations in a microsecond. When she was born, the largest number of people you could address was by shouting. Maybe this would be about the limit of it. When she died, if you could get access to a television camera, the whole population of the world could hear you. And when she was born, the largest number of people you could kill at any one time was with a Lewis machine gun, if anyone knows what that means, those old big machine guns on a tripod, and you put a belt of ammunition in one side and fired it off, and then when the belt of ammunition ran out, you put another one in. So you could perhaps kill 50, 60 people at once. Now you can kill millions of people. Indeed, in the summer, when it was thought there might be a nuclear war between India and Pakistan, people were talking about 12 million people dying. I mean, just absolutely mind-boggling at the losses there could be if modern weapons were used in a war of that character. And what technology does is very interesting. First of all, it raises the moral content in political decision-making. I heard somebody on the BBC the other day say there's now no difference between left and right. Well, I won't argue that, but there's still a difference between right and wrong. And if you do something which involves killing a large number of people, you don't have to be a PhD in atomic physics to have a view as to whether it's right or not. And therefore the moral content is something that puts us all on an equal footing, because everyone's entitled to say what they think is right and wrong. They can disagree, but at least they're discussing that. And it's one thing to kill one man with a knife or a bayonet. I mean, that's contrary to the Ten Commandments. If you kill 12 million people, you're in a different ball game altogether. And so the thing, there's another aspect of it, and that is, if you have all this technology, what do you use it for? I don't know if anyone remembers, but years ago when the space race began, and Neil Armstrong landed on the moon and all that, the Russians also landed on the moon, and they put a little tracked vehicle. It was like a toy tractor with caterpillar tracks. It ran along the surface of the moon. And I had a letter from a constituent in Bristol who said, "Dear Tony, I see the Russians have put a tracked vehicle on the moon. Could we have a better bus service in Bristol?" Now, you can laugh, but it was actually a very, very relevant question. Enormously relevant question. Why can't we use the technology to meet our needs instead of in some games in the space race? And so these things, all these arguments that all these powers I've mentioned, the power of money, the power of faith, the power of knowledge, the power of technology, really raise in my mind, how do we get some control of it? Because it's not very easy to get control of it. Because, as I say, increasingly we're being managed. Now, of course, the last source of power, which you can't leave out of account, is the military power. When you go back at the beginning of history, it's always been the case. I was in Beijing some years ago, and they're talking about Genghis Khan, who was a great horde spread over into northern Europe. And the Chinese said, using modern jargon, they said, of course, the horse was the delivery vehicle, but the warhead was gunpowder, which we invented, said the Chinese, which they did. And even our history, Julius Caesar landed here in 55 BC. He actually brought a single currency, when you come to think of it, the penny, which we still use. I mentioned that to Mrs. Thatcher the other day. I said, you weren't the first Iron Lady. And she said, what do you mean? So I said, well, Moa the Seer raised 7,000 men of Essex, who were the Icenian, raised the men of Essex and killed 7,000 Romans, but it wasn't a joke. It went down very well, but still. That was military power. Then we had William the Conqueror, who stole all the land, what the story of Robin Hood is about. Robin Hood lost his land when the Normans arrived. And of course, we had a huge empire. When I was born in 1925, 20% of the population of the world was governed directly or indirectly from London. And empires are funny things because they not only, well, they deny democracy to the countries you've occupied. I remember in Egypt in 1945, when I came back from, I was there at the end of the war, they gave me an identity card, which I still have because I've kept everything. And there's a picture of this young pilot, and it says, this man is exempt from Egyptian law. Why? Because we occupied Egypt in 1880 and we were still there. And when I see the Americans who are building the biggest empire the world's ever known, I sympathize with them. I say, I know how you feel because you think everybody hates you. But actually all they want you to do is to get out and develop their own society. And you see, it is so, this is where a little bit of history helps, and I'm not an academic in any way, but take Zimbabwe, you know, everyone's talked about Mugabe and so on and so on. Well, I was in Zimbabwe during the war. It was then known as Rhodesia. I learned to fly there. And when we were there was no democracy of any sort or kind. There were 60,000 whites and, 2 or 3 million Africans, and the whole thing was totally controlled by the whites. Not only controlled by the whites, but Cecil Rhodes went there in 1897, the year my mum was born, and took all the land from the Africans and gave it to the white farmers. Now, they never mentioned that. I'm not justifying Mugabe, but he's done exactly what Cecil Rhodes did, only he's given it back to the Africans. And not only that, we went to Africa and occupied it and stole the land, but we sold their people into slavery in America. And somebody sent me an article the other day in The Economist. As everybody knows, The Economist is a very responsible newspaper. Every serious politician has to read The Economist. And The Economist had an article in 1848 about the slave trade. And what they said was, you cannot abolish the slave trade, said The Economist, because there are all these ignorant blacks in Africa who have nothing whatever to do, and they're needed on the plantations of America. What you should do, said The Economist, is to regulate the slave trade. So I thought of an organization called Off Slave, supervised by Chris Woodhead, that would name and shame slave ships where the sanitary arrangements fell below the acceptable standard. But the point really you have to recognize is that is real power. And if you're going to have democracy inside somebody else's empire, it's very difficult, because think of all the way we treated all the people who wanted to be independent. I mean, they were all put in a British jail. Number of anti-colonial leaders I've met who were in British jail. I met Nehru, he was in jail. I met Nkomo, he was in jail. Nkrumah, he was in jail. Chedi Jagan, he was in jail. Makarios, he was in jail. And I mean, the history of the anti-colonial movement, how our empire disappeared, was you begin in a British jail, you end up having tea with the Queen as head of state. And of course, Mandela was described as a terrorist by Mrs. Thatcher. And with one, of course, they weren't all engaged in military activity, which Mandela was. In 1931, I met Mr. Gandhi, came to London, and my dad took me to see him. You know, when you're 6, what normally happens is the guy pats you on the head and talks to your dad, but Gandhi was sitting on the floor, so I sat next to him. I don't know what he said to me or what I said to him wouldn't matter, but I was touched, that I felt that, you know, he took an interest. He'd just come out of a British prison and was just going back into a British prison, and you know the old joke, when he was in London, some journalist said to him, what do you think of civilization in Britain? And Gandhi said, I think it would be a very good idea. And he conveyed exactly what he felt. But that's why you have to be just a little bit careful about taking what I might call the established view every morning in the papers, because it doesn't take account of the history, it doesn't take account of the difference of opinion and so on. And if we are to have peace, we have to find some way of resolving our differences without violence. On the troop ship in 45, when I came back, I heard for the first time the preamble of the Charter of the United Nations, which is imprinted in my mind. We, the peoples of the United Nations, said the Charter, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has caused untold suffering to mankind. Those words represent all I believe, because if you can't, with nuclear, chemical, biological weapons, you can't have peace unless you actually sit down and try and deal with the causes of war, the injustice, and so on. So that's what I feel about it. Now, I'm leave lots of time, I hope, for questions. Well, I've gone on a bit longer than I meant, so I'll call it a halt here, because we're going to have an interval and then the question. But when I do my diary at night, which I do, I've done it since I was, heavens, about 15 consistently, and now I dictate it in tape. Sometimes when I look at the world, I get so depressed at the what could happen. I think it's possible the human race could obliterate itself if we reached the wrong decisions. And I find it difficult even to get my feelings onto my tape recorder. Sometimes, however, when I look at the world and I see the technology that is at our disposal, and its phenomenal potential for good, I get so thrilled, I wonder whether it's good for someone of 78 to get as excited as I do. So we have an interval, and then we have questions, and thank you for listening. Now we come to the bit I enjoy, which is the questions, but I must warn you that I'm a bit deaf, and I tell you how I discovered it. Years ago in Bristol, on a very, very hot night in an election, the schoolroom packed to the doors, and there was a heckler. Well, as you can imagine, after all those years in Parliament, I know how to deal with a heckler. I said, you organise your own meeting, don't you? And finally I heard what he said, which was, would somebody open the window? So after that, I got a couple of hearing aids myself. There are people with radio mics, and to avoid bothering David Dimbleby to choose the questions, I thought the best thing to do would be to ask the people with the mics to indicate if you want to speak, and one will pick a man and one a woman, and they'll go up and down the hall, so I won't have to bother with that. And then any questions you want to ask, I'll do the best I can. So, who would like to ask the first one?
Would you like to comment on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
Yes, on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I mean, it is the most appalling tragedy for everybody. At the end of the war, I mentioned I was in Egypt. I wrote to the Jewish agency in Ben Yehuda Street in Jerusalem and said, could I stay in a kibbutz? And believe it or not, I was rowing on the Sea of Galilee, it's like a Bible story, the day the war ended. And we landed at Capernaum. And an old Jew said the war is over, and I had an orange juice to celebrate. And then I went back to the kibbutz, and that night the Jews from all over the world danced their national dances. And then there was somebody said something in Hebrew, and I said, what's he said? And he said, the English pilots will now dance an English national dance. And I'm told that Bumps-a-Daisy is still very popular in the Sea of Galilee. So I say this so that don't misunderstand me at all. The establishment of the State of Israel I supported, but Sharon is trying to destroy the Palestinians and prevent them having a state. He's denying just almost as many UN resolutions as Saddam. The Americans have vetoed 80 resolutions that would have enforced the Israelis, and I think that the Israelis should be, I'm not arguing for some, but I think real pressure should be brought to bear to establish a Palestinian state immediately on the lines that the UN itself laid down, allow it to be established and developed. And that is the only basis on which you can have peace. That's my opinion. And I think that's what we ought to do. Now, have we got another question lined up? Who's there? Wave at me, because I don't see.
If you were in David Blunkett's shoes now, what would your position be on asylum seekers?
Well, on asylum seekers, I mean, it's a very important question, this. I fear asylum seekers are being made the scapegoats. I mentioned, I think, the 1930s, and one thing I saw in the 30s was the fascists marching through London on a Sunday in their black shirts, screaming at the Jews and the socialists and the trade unionists and the gays and so on. And nowadays, there are people screaming at the Muslims and foreigners and so on. And I think that although you have to have some measure of, you can't have anybody move anywhere, probably with an aging population, we will need more people in this country to earn income. And somebody came up to me the other day and said we should send the blacks home. Well, I'm in a difficulty about that because my mother was a Scot. My wife was an American of French and Irish extraction. One son has married a girl who's half Jewish and half Indian, so I have two little Bengali grandchildren from Calcutta, and another son has married a Muslim. I mean, I'm breeding a UN peacekeeping force in my own family. And I mean, actually, if people are asylum seekers from torture, we justify bombing Afghanistan because of what the Taliban did, but if they arrive, oh no. So you have to be sensible about it. But it is very easy if you lose your job for some other reason to blame the asylum seeker and people think they're all given BMW cars and all that, and it's a very hard life. So I think you have to be very sensitive about it. And the most important thing is not to whip up hostility to people who've really suffered. I was talking to somebody earlier this evening who was involved in bringing Jewish children from Europe. My father was involved in that too. And they were brought from Europe and welcomed here. And there was a lot of anti-Semitism at the time. And yet these children now, old people of my age and older, can talk with real feeling about how they were welcomed here. So that's my feeling about it. But I know everybody can't go anywhere because it just, you have to have some sensible planning. But don't identify them as the problem when perhaps it's the governments doing things which create the problems that other people blame on the asylum seekers. Now, is there another one ready? Yeah.
I wonder if in the spirit of democracy I could ask two questions and you select which one you'd like to answer. The first is, do you think that there's any constraint upon the valuing of ordinary people by the existence of a monarchy and aristocracy? And secondly, what is it you now don't believe, perhaps, that you did believe when you were younger, or perhaps believed more profoundly now?
Well, let me take the first question second. I've changed my mind on many things. I've been wrong on lots of things. My diary is a confession of all the mistakes I've made. Some right-wing journalist came to one of the lectures and said, "Have you ever made a mistake?" I said, "Yes, read it in the diary," and it put him off a bit. Because, of course, there's nothing wrong with making a mistake. Looking back on my life, what I would be really ashamed of is I ever thought I'd said something I didn't believe to get on, and I don't think I've done that. I've tried to say what I believe, but for example, I was quite wrong about nuclear power. I thought civil nuclear power was cheap, safe and peaceful. And it isn't cheap, it's 3 times the cost of coal. It isn't safe, very dangerous, and it wasn't peaceful. The plutonium from our civil power stations was going to America for their atomic bomb program. Now that's one example, I'll give you a lot of others. Now on the question of monarchy, I'm glad you asked it because, you see, it's nothing whatever to do with the Queen. I danced with the Queen, funnily enough, in 1945. I met her at a dance and I won her in a raffle. I think I was Debenham and she was Freebody or whatever it is, it was that sort of a raffle. And she's nothing to do with it at all. She's done a very boring job for 50 years, and I can't imagine a more boring job, and the Jubilee was a recognition of what she'd done. The problem is the Crown, which is a legal entity. Now, having a Crown means the Prime Minister can go to war against Iraq without consulting Parliament. Why? Because going to war is a royal prerogative. Nothing to do with the Queen. She's not going to decide it. He will. The Crown is the fount of honour. So the Prime Minister's put 248 people into Parliament in the House of Lords by using the royal prerogative. And you know what he does. If you've got patronage on that scale, a difficult newspaper editor is given a peerage and he might be a bit more friendly. Or somebody gives a bit of money to the party, and I won't say it happens, but he might end up in with something, some honour or another. And that's the royal prerogative. When the Prime Minister or any minister goes to Brussels, Treaty making is a royal prerogative. So in Brussels, laws are made that apply in Britain without Parliament having any say in the matter, because that's a royal prerogative. So I believe all the Crown prerogatives should be handed to Parliament. I introduced a bill on that. And I got the support of David Davis, the Conservative former chairman, and even Ian Paisley supported it. He knocked me down with a feather. Because that is the problem. The problem is we have a totally undemocratic core in our Constitution. You and I are not allowed to elect our head of state, we're not allowed to elect the House of Lords, and even the House of Commons has no power against these royal prerogatives, which have nothing to do with the Queen. And I get very angry when people attack the Queen, because it's an irrelevance. I know it's fun to think about the Queen's butler and all that if you're fed up with Ulrika Johnson and all that, or Edwina Currie, but it isn't what it is about. And I think a lot of the Republican talk with snipes is stupid and irrelevant. And so that's my feeling about it. I hope I answered both questions. I made mistakes, and I better add, I might have made a mistake on this, but I don't think I have, actually. Is there somebody else? Yeah.
You talked earlier about us being managed, the nation being managed. I would personally go one step further and say we're potentially being nannied. What I'm curious about is why we allow it. Why do you think we've lost our sense of self? And why have we abandoned our willingness to take personal responsibility for anything these days?
Well, why have we, it's a moral question you ask, why have we abandoned see, I'm not so sure that you're right to be gloomy about the human condition. I mean, there's good and bad in everybody, isn't there? I know that because I know I have it in myself. The purpose of society should be to encourage the good and inhibit the bad. I mean, I'm not talking about criminal law, but I'm talking about in general. And I thought when Mrs. Thatcher said there's no such thing as society, that was a mistake. Because people aren't motivated solely by money, are they? I mean, think of people who look after disabled children. Somebody has a Down syndrome child, looks after them till they're 30, 40, worry about them when they die, who'll look after their parents, look after... I think that all the best things in society, on the whole, are when people do it out of a sense of duty and pleasure. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I'm a great believer in the public services. I think the public services, whether they're nurses, doctors, firefighters, teachers, and so on, do contribute a core of moral responsibility to society which we should respect and not brush aside. And this idea everything can be measured in money, I think is wrong. You can't actually do that. You know what they say, knows the value, the cost of everything and the value of nothing. And there's something in that. So also when I look back at my childhood, you know, talk about the old days when we had moral responsibility. When I was young, what did I do? I had a letter from the government when I was 17. Dear Mr. Benn, it said, will you turn up when you're 17 and a half? We'll give you free food, free clothes, free accommodation, 2 shillings a day if you'll just kill Germans. It was a youth training scheme of a kind. And the Germans had a similar letter. Dear Herr Braun, if you will kill the British. And if you can have full employment to kill people, I ask myself, why in God's name can't you have full employment to provide the houses for homeless people, look after nurses, teachers, and why? Because it isn't profitable. And you have to question this idea that profit is at the core of it all. I mean, I know if you're in production, you've got to have a market. I know all that, obviously know that. But I don't think society is really just should be built around that. And I wouldn't want to lecture anybody else on what they should do. I was brought up on the Bible, judge not that ye be not judged. Let he who is with sin cast the first stone. I'm very modest about it. But if anybody asks my advice, I say what I think, ideas that might be useful to them. But don't be too depressed about the human condition. Maybe the problem is much more at the top of societies and not necessarily among the generality of people. You have to believe it can be done. I mean, hope is the fuel of progress, and fear and depression is a prison into which we confine ourselves. So if I end up on a bit of an upbeat, it's because I'd be sorry if you thought we were all lost. We may be, but you might be wrong too.
What if you had a view on fox hunting? The banning of fox hunting, the government's weak-kneed approach, despite their promise about banning it in the last manifesto?
Yes, well, I must admit that fox hunting and bear baiting and public executions and cockfighting have always seemed to me to be slightly uncivilized. What the Labour Party manifesto said in 1970, we'll have a free vote in the House of Commons, which sounded fair enough because, for example, Anne Widdecombe is passionately against fox hunting. I saw her in our lobby. I said, Anne, it's lovely to have you here. And she glared at me and said it won't happen very often, but at least she was in the lobby. And then blow me down, when we had an overwhelming majority, right? The Prime Minister stalled it, wouldn't put it to the Lords, and so you can't say have a free vote if it doesn't mean anything. I mean, after all, we aren't the Westminster Debating Society. We're supposed to be an elected parliament. And the overwhelming majority of people are opposed to it in country as well. Because, you know, if you live in the countryside, you find that the hunt's gone over your allotment and you complain to the police and the magistrate's the master of foxhounds. So I think, I mean, I've always have voted against it, and I hope very much that the parliamentary majority is there. I don't either quite believe that there are thousands and thousands of jobs at stake, although they say that. There certainly were lots of jobs at stake when the miners were being hammered, and I don't remember the hunters coming to help them, but that's perhaps a different point. Right. Now, perhaps because of the fact, oh yes, we are going to have some women that side, otherwise we're all the men that side. So will you look for a man next? Don't misunderstand me. Yeah.
May I ask you, what are your views on the euro and United States of Europe?
Well, I was in, my view of the euro and the United States of Europe, I was in Brussels, funny enough, talking like this a couple of nights ago, and a lot of questions asked about that. The British ambassador to the EU was there. My view on this is very simple. I was born a European, I'll die one. The question is, what sort of Europe? And I bitterly resent the idea that if you don't agree with the present structure, you're anti-European. And there are four types of Europe. There's the Europe of nations, which on the whole I think Mrs. Thatcher wants. And if you talk to Ted Heath, who's an old mate of mine, in the sense I've known him 50 years, what Ted says to you is, Tony, well, he's a grumpy old so-and-so, but what Ted Heath says is this. He said, Tony, we've slaughtered 50 million people in 2 world wars, we can't do it again. I agree with him. I think he's right. And that's a political argument. But this idea that in the bowels of the Treasury, a computer is grinding away night and day to tell us at what point we give up the right to govern ourselves is ridiculous. Now, I was on the Council of Ministers for 4 years, and I learned a lot about it. Obviously, I was the president of the Council of Energy Ministers in 1977. First of all, the European Parliament is not a parliament. The laws are made by the Council of Ministers. And it meets in secret. It's the only parliament in the world that meets in secret. During my presidency, I wrote to all of them and said, why don't we let the press in? Because we're a parliament. They nearly strangled me because the dirty little deals would get out into the open. And when ministers go, when I went there, I went with the royal prerogative of treaty making in my hand. I could agree to things which repealed laws in Britain without Parliament knowing and could impose laws in Britain. Totally undemocratic. Second thing is, of course, under the Maastricht Treaty, a central bank has been set up. Now, the central bank in Frankfurt has managed to get the European Union to agree to what's called a stability pact, which means that no minister in any member of the European Union, even without joining the euro, can spend or borrow more than a certain percentage of our national income. That's why we're privatizing. Because if Gordon Brown wants to put more money into health and education, which I'm sure he does, he can't, because it would be illegal under the Stability Pact. So he has to privatize. They never tell you that. But the European enterprise, I mentioned the World Trade Organization and the IMF, the central bank is one of the main agencies of privatization. And on my basis of, you know, if you can't get rid of them, you don't live in a democracy. You can't get rid of the Commission, you can't get rid of the bank, and they run Europe, the key decisions. So that's the present system. Now, there are two other possibilities. One is United States of Europe, where you would go just like the United States. You'd have a Senate and a House of Representatives, you'd elect a president. It would be bigger than the United States. My fear is it'd be too cumbersome, but I couldn't complain it wasn't democratic. It would have one great merit. You'd sack the Commission, and you'd also, the central bank would become Alan Greenspan, and he would be a bit more accountable. The third solution, which is the one I've advocated, is a Commonwealth of Europe, There are 50 countries in Europe, including Russia. And we should have a mini United Nations with a Council of Ministers and an Assembly, and you harmonise by the consent of national parliaments. It would be a bit slower, but what you did would have been consented to. My fear about the present system is if we're not careful, it will lead to nationalism. Because when people discover that some bureaucrat has forced them to sell off their hospital or something, instead of blaming the system, they'll say it's those damn Germans or the Italians again or the Spaniards. And you could find the European Union breaking up in the way Yugoslavia did. So, I mean, I've given a long answer, but I think it's a very important question. To summarise it all, I will never agree to be governed by someone I cannot get rid of on polling day. It's as simple as that, because they won't listen to me if they're there. And that is not anti-European, that's pro-democratic.
Having worked so hard at one point in your life to stay out of the House of Lords, who do you now think should be in it?
Well, I mean, the problem of the House of Lords, I had a special problem. The background to it is very simple. My dad was a Labour MP. He was so keen to fight the fascists that in 1940, when he was 63, he rejoined the Air Force and got himself as an air gunner at the end. He must have been an absolute menace. I wouldn't have wanted an air gunner. And he got stuck in a gun turret on one occasion, and they couldn't land till they'd released him. But that's by the by. He was a member of Parliament, and Churchill said to Attlee, we've got a coalition, now we'd like some Labour peers. And Attlee said to my dad, will you do it? My dad would have been 70 at the end of the war, he agreed to it. And there were no life peers then, they were all hereditary. And I had an elder brother, Michael. And Michael was a pilot, and my dad asked him, and Michael said, oh, I'm not interested. I think he wanted to be a Christian minister. So my dad accepted it. My brother was then killed in 1944. I was elected to Parliament in 1950, and 10 years after I was elected to Parliament in 1960, my dad died. And so they threw me out of the House of Commons on the grounds my blood had turned blue. I mean, I'm not kidding you. And it took me 10 years to get rid of the damn thing. Before I left, I got some doctor to take blue blood out, and I've got a little bottle of blue blood at home. It's clotted now, but it was the real thing. But you see, the hereditary system is ludicrous. I mean, if I went to the dentist and he opened my mouth and began drilling and said, by the way, Tony, I'm not a dentist myself, but my father was a dentist, I would say, thank you very much indeed. Or if you went on holiday and on the announcement on the plane, the pilot said that my grandfather was trained as a pilot, say, thanks very much, I think I'll catch the next plane. It's ludicrous, but it isn't just the hereditaries, it's the fact you appoint people to Parliament. I mean, there was a debate in the House of Lords by all these wise old peers about employment, and one peer said to another, my lords, nowadays no one can expect a job for life. Well, they've bloody well got a job for life. You know what I mean? Their life peer goes on till he dies, and the hereditary peer, of course, hands it on. So I think we should have an elected second chamber. Actually, my own opinion is we've got a Scottish Parliament, a Welsh Assembly, we've got a Northern Ireland thing coming along. We should have an English Parliament and a small elected federal chamber dealing with matters and relations between England, Scotland and Wales. That's my opinion, and funnily enough, Ted Heath takes the same view. I told you I was a bit of a mate of mine, and to my surprise, he took that view. And I think that is what will happen. But the Prime Minister desperately doesn't want it to happen because he'd take away his patronage. And that was true of Mrs. Tia, not that she made as many peers as Blair made. But the Prime Minister keeps the monarchy going because the monarchy gives him the powers that he needs. And that's the problem. So I think we'll get there in the end. But now they've got a new scheme, I think, under which half will be elected, so that half the dentists will be qualified to deal with you. Right, who's next? Oh, I hope somebody goes up to the gallery, because there may be people there.
Do you think the power of party leaders and chief whips over their party undermines the democratic process because MPs can't correctly represent their constituents? And what should we do about it?
The power of whips and party leaders. Well, let me start at the beginning. If you want to do anything, you have to work with other people. I mean, you might want to go into Parliament. put your ideas to the electors and they might vote for you. When you're there, what could you actually do? You've got to work with other people. And I'm not at all ashamed about being a member of the Labour Party. I joined it on my 16th birthday. I intend to die in it, but not yet, not immediately. And I regard it as a body of people who should have some common aims. But when it comes to the individual votes, I think you have to exercise your own judgment. And for example, one of the first things that was done by the new Labour government in '97 was to cut the lone parent benefit. And I voted against it. I'm sorry, but I couldn't go along with that because lone parents have a tough time. Now, the whips weren't very, very pleased with me, but I always told them when I was going to vote against the government. I voted against selection in education. I voted against student fees. I voted against all of that. I voted against the war, Kosovo and Afghanistan. And I always told the chief whip, and I tried not to attack people, but in a way, you have to live with yourself, you know. I've got my image, the only image I care about is my face when I shave it in the morning. You've got to be able to look yourself in the mirror and know that what you've done is what you believe in. So that's perfectly compatible, but just being an individual on your own, you wouldn't get very far. I mean, you know, unity is strength applies to political campaigns as well as industrial campaigns. So it's perfectly possible, but increasingly difficult now, because if you're a young member, you might not even get selected if you cause trouble. And there is an attempt to pressurize people. And I think MPs should deal with that just by saying, I'm sorry, I'm not going along with that. I'm a loyal man. I'll vote for you on a vote of confidence, but I'm not going along with things like this end of jury trials or double jeopardy, things that are coming up now, which people feel very strongly about. I think MPs should simply say, I'm not voting for it. And that does bring pressure to bear on the government, because they don't like to look as if they haven't got a full majority. All right, who's got the mic next? You have.
Apart from yourself, who would you say is the greatest Prime Minister this country's never had? And what might they have achieved?
Well, you know, it's very kind of you to make a personal reference, but may I tell you this, that the speeches in Parliament I've heard that have really been impressive have very often been ones that you wouldn't expect. I'll give you one example. I don't know if anyone remembers Robert Maxwell. He was an absolute crook. I knew him. He fell off the end of his yacht in the Mediterranean, or I don't know whether he's alive, living somewhere else. But in 1968, when the Red Army moved into Czechoslovakia, you know he was a Czech. He got up in the House of Commons. The House was recalled in September '68. And Maxwell got up and he said, Mr. Speaker, 30 years ago today, I joined the Czech army to keep Hitler out of Czechoslovakia. Now, you could have heard a pin drop. Here was a man speaking from his own experience. And then he went on with a very muddled speech about we should all write letters to Brezhnev. I never heard such rubbish in my life. But the point was it came out of his experience. I'll give you another example. There are not many now, but there'll be old miners in the House who'd, very rarely, miners didn't very often speak in the House, but there'd be a pit disaster. And some old miner would get up and he'd say, Mr. Speaker, I worked in that pit for 30 years and, you know, it was so moving because it came from his experience. And the best speeches I've ever heard were made by women from the women's support groups in the miners' strike who'd never spoken before. Make a speech, a tremendous speech, and I'd thank them afterwards, and they'd say, oh, Tony, I'd never spoken before. And the women in the women's support groups and the women who supported the Liverpool dockers, marvellous. So there isn't anything in oratory. I don't believe you practice before a mirror. You say what you feel, and a speech is a relationship between a speaker, an audience, a time, a place, and a subject. It's not like a book. When you write a book, who knows going to read it or when or why? But a meeting like this, you know, I can see if people seem to be disagreeing, you'll say it again, or if they're all dozing off, you try and be more interesting. You know, it's what they call interactive. There was a lad came from Liverpool. You know, the dockers in Liverpool were on strike for a long time. Lad came from Liverpool last year to the Chesterfield Labour Club, and he said, what's the difference between a terrorist and a Liverpool woman? And we were all shaking in our boots. He said, you can negotiate with a terrorist. Well, now, that's what makes oratory. It's commitment. And I will listen to anybody who I know believes what they say, but even a clever speaker using his hands in the right way, if I didn't think he meant what he said, it wouldn't make any impact on me. So don't look for heroes. Look for movements and teachers. Teachers explain the world, and movements bring hopes to fruition. But I'm not a great believer in heroes or great parliamentarians. Right, now who else has got the mic? Where? Oh, good, I can see you too, okay?
I was wondering if you have any regrets about losing to Dennis Healey, the deputy leadership of the Labour Party, and whether you think, looking back, what sort of a difference you would have made if you'd actually won that election.
Well, I mean, when you say standing for the deputy leadership, I mean, I feel like somebody appearing before the magistrate because asking for 3 other offences to be taken into account, because I stood twice for the deputy leadership and twice for the leadership. And I tell you why I did it. I did it because I saw leadership elections as an opportunity to have a debate about the future policy, and I would put forward what I believed in. I didn't say what I thought would get me elected. I'm not saying I ever could have been elected. But I was only interested in being elected if there was a majority in favour of what I was saying. And I wouldn't have wanted to get there on the basis that I hadn't said it. 1 or 2 friends said to me, "Oh, Tony, tone it down and you'll win, and then when you get there you can do it." I wasn't interested in that. So I have absolutely no regrets whatever. I think people who have regrets in politics destroy themselves. They don't destroy anyone else. Ted Heath, I mentioned, he was grumpy because Mrs. Thatcher beat him. And it's a pity because, you know, Ted took us into Europe and so on. He's a distinguished man, but he's never forgiven Mrs. Thatcher. I think the reason he won't go into the House of Lords is afraid he might find himself sitting next to her. And I think that's damaged him. It certainly hasn't damaged Mrs. Thatcher. And so my view of politics is not how high do you climb up the greasy pole. That's not my view at all. I'm an extremely happy man. I hope that's evident to you. I'm not putting it on. I'm really enjoying my life. And I left Parliament to devote more time to politics, as you know, and this is what I'm doing.
If Britain is the 4th or 5th richest country in the world, why can't we afford to pay public sector workers a living wage, a wage that they can have a decent standard of living on?
Well, the question of the public service workers, it applies to firemen, applies to nurses, applies to teachers. You can't have public services on the cheap. Now, America is the richest country in the world, overwhelmingly. And 41 million people in America have absolutely no health insurance whatever. I mean, it does tell you something about a society based on profit as distinct from based on need. Now, Cuba, one of the poorest countries of the world, has got a higher standard of education and a higher standard of health than the United States, which is blockading them. And I think that this is a matter of will, not money. Because I sat in Parliament when I first elected with Aaron Bevan, who was Minister of Health. He was a Welsh miner. He'd seen the suffering ill health brought to the miners in the 20s and 30s. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we were bankrupt. But when the health service was introduced in 1948, it was completely free. No charge for prescriptions, for spectacles, for wigs, for anything, for health care, for aftercare, and it's been eroded. And of course, it's a matter of will. And what we have to do is to bring this home to the government. I mean, I went to see the firefighters this afternoon in the fire station. I probably mentioned they'd privatised the fire station. Yesterday I went to the Lambeth, the headquarters, to talk to the lads, and one of them had come from Nottingham, another from Wales, because he couldn't afford to live in London. And it is a moral question, really. If they do starve them of resources, then are they just using that as an excuse for privatising them? You know, if you leave them without the money they need, people say, oh, we better have something better. We better hand it over to modern management. And so I have a feeling there is an absolutely major attack on the public services going on at the moment in the guise of modernisation. Isn't it funny, when they modernised the work of Parliament, it meant shorter hours for MPs. But it's not the same for others. And this percentage business, a percentage, 100% of nothing is nothing. 1% of Rupert Murdoch's would make you a millionaire. You know, we ought to think it out very carefully. Another thing I feel when I watch the media is this. Do you ever remember the same coverage for the importance of the fire service until the strike? And we now realise, well, we knew, but they needed for flooding, they needed for fires, they maybe needed for terrorism, and all of a sudden now, all the media coverage is about the strike, but what about the firefighters? Why don't we hear about them on the hour, if you know what I mean, the public service is on the hour? So I think the media have a responsibility. I know lots of individual journalists are very sympathetic, but, you know, the rules are. Did anyone ever see that film about Orgreaves that was on the other day? It was, you remember the so-called Orgreaves riot. And the reason I ask is I played a part in it because the night of the so-called Orgreaves riot, I went down to the BBC to do a meeting, literally within hours. And the guys running the BBC News said this to me, Tony, when the film came in from Orgreaves, you saw the police cavalry charge and then some miners threw stones. And we were ordered by our editor to change the film to show the miners throwing stones and then the police cavalry coming in to give the impression there was a riot. Well, of course, they went to trial for riot, and Arthur Scargill, who's a bright lad, subpoenaed the police video that had a time code on it and proved what I had been told. And so the media have enormous power, and people working in the media have a moral responsibility, not just journalists, they're human beings. And coming back to this question of personal responsibility, I think people have a responsibility to tell the truth. And members of Parliament too, for that matter. I think a society that doesn't tell the truth, and I support the firefighters. I hope the government gets the message. But like all disputes of that kind, it isn't the brute force of the strike, it's public opinion that's going to win this for you. And I think that the firefighters have been very sensible in saying, you know, they'll go out in an emergency to save life. Because it isn't, you're not trying to put, the argument isn't with the people at home, the argument with the government that offered 16%, or the local authorities offered 16%, and the government stopped it being given to you. And I think that a horrible feeling, I wonder whether Mr. Blair is trying to do a Thatcher on the miners, because if so, it would be a terrible mistake, in my opinion. And I don't know how you feel, but I just feel the firefighters, who, for all they do to save us, deserve our support when they're in a jam. That's my feeling.
Given that Mr. Hoon, our estimable Defence Secretary, has recently said that we can't rule out first use of nuclear weapons, I wonder what this tells us about morality and New Labour.
Well, I think the whole question of nuclear weapons does raise a whole clutch of questions. I've been to Hiroshima and I've been to Nagasaki. And I think over 100,000 people were killed. There was an American pilot. He had a nervous breakdown later when he realized what he'd done. And I think that when weapons of war get to that level, they do raise primarily moral questions. Because, you know, terrorism is defined as killing innocent people in pursuit of a political objective. Well, nuclear weapons are the supreme form of terrorism. And Bush has said now that he doesn't rule out, if I heard your question, you were referring to that, but I think probably Jeff Hoon has done the same, our Minister of Defence, doesn't rule out the use of nuclear weapons. Although it was agreed when they were trying to get world disarmament that, first of all, there would be no spread of nuclear weapons. That was the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And secondly, that the nuclear powers would promise never to use it first. That's all been dropped. Bush has now identified, I think, 6 countries that are enemies, enemy nations where he would feel free to strike preemptively, an axis of evil. And as you know, Sharon in Israel wants the war to extend to Iran. And if we go into Iraq, which I think will be primarily about oil, then how do you know it won't go into Iran and into Saudi Arabia if the Saudi government falls? So if on top of that nuclear weapons are used, another crime against humanity will be committed. And just as I mentioned, you know, when I was in Egypt, I was exempt from Egyptian law. The Americans are determined to have a court of international justice, but Americans are to be exempted from it, so they can do what they like. And these are huge questions. I think popular movements do have an effect. And the peace movement, there were 400,000 people in Hyde Park the other day. I think it was an indication of feeling. I don't think the majority of people in this country, truthfully, are in favour of the Prime Minister going along with Bush's war in Iraq. I don't know if I interpret your thoughts that way, but I'm not at all sure there's that enthusiasm for the war, for a whole range of reasons, one of which there are women living in Baghdad tonight will be widows in a few weeks. Children will be orphaned because we've bombed them. And yet Saddam Hussein was armed by the Americans. Rumsfeld, who wants the war, was in Baghdad in '81, selling, at a time America was selling him chemical weapons. I spent 3 hours with Saddam myself in 1990. I went to see him to see if he could persuade him to release all the British hostages, which he did. And of course he told me all about what the Americans had done, and I knew it. We armed the Americans. And when Saddam used chemical weapons against Halabja, America was supplying them. And now that's the great excuse for war. No, I share your anxiety if I interpreted your question to be an expression of that anxiety. I think it would be morally wrong and a crime against humanity to launch the war that I fear is now in preparation.
Often people who are critical of a more progressive and fairer society simply say, who's going to pay for it? Where's the money going to come from? Wouldn't it be a nice idea to give the firefighters more money? Wouldn't it be a nice idea to give teachers more money? Wouldn't it be a nice idea to give nurses more money? Do we have a shortage of revenue? And if so, where should this revenue come from? Or do we actually have enough money and it needs to be better distributed? And if so, how should the money be better distributed? From a cynical point of view, who are going to be the winners, who are going to be the losers?
Well, it's a perfectly fair question. I mean, if I argue for the firefighters, I've got to answer that question. In 1997, when Labour won the election, the Prime Minister said that he would not increase taxation on the very wealthy, and he would not increase expenditure beyond what the Conservatives had done. So for the first 5 years, from 1997 to 2001, Kenneth Clarke was still in effect Chancellor of the Exchequer. He ring-fenced the rich to protect them and means-tested the poor so as to avoid paying decent pensions. I mean, I'm putting it crudely. There is plenty of money for the war, plenty of money for the Dome, dare I say, plenty of money for the royal family, and lots of fat cats getting huge increases that are never commented upon, but not enough for the fire servants and the teachers and the nurses. I mean, I think you just have to make up your own mind. If you want the public services provided, and your house might catch fire or mine, or you might be ill, or I might, or you might be unemployed, was too late for me because I've retired. But you need those services. You have to find the money for it. And strangely enough, I think if you put that openly and frankly to people, most people would agree with you. I can't imagine anyone would say, I'd rather that the public firefighters were embittered and defeated than that we funded as fire service we need. I may be wrong. Perhaps I have too high an opinion of people's commitment. In general, I think the politicians and the media think that we're a lot of nitwits. Whereas actually the level of intelligence and understanding, in my opinion, is much higher than they're given credit for. If you put the point to people have to decide. But when you think how much the war's going to cost, you do wonder why that takes priority over security at home. I mean, that's my view. I hope I haven't caused ill will by saying it, but that's what I honestly feel.
What do you think about the changes to the criminal justice system announced in the Queen's speech this week?
I mean, clearly people do want dangerous people arrested and charged and convicted if the evidence can be there. And we have a problem. The prisons are overcrowded. I mean, literally, absolutely up to the full. There was a riot the other day in Lincoln Prison where the prisoners escaped and set fire to it, and to find a place even for the 200 prisoners who were moved was very difficult. And I think one of the things that the government is thinking about and needs to think about is the sentencing policy of magistrates. I don't know if any women are still put in prison for not paying the television license, but if they are, they shouldn't. The double jeopardy thing raises a different question, because the principle, as you know, of English law is you're innocent, presumed innocent until proved guilty, and if acquitted, that is the end of the matter. Now, of course, with DNA testing, You could not only acquit people later, like this guy who got out today after 25 years for a crime he didn't commit, but you could also prove somebody who was acquitted did it. And then the question of, if you abolish double jeopardy, are you going to pursue people forever who've been acquitted? And that raises quite a difficult question, because, you know, there might be those who were certain someone was guilty, but they were acquitted, and then they go back and back and back, and you create a group of persons who don't have the normal civil liberties. But I think the Prime Minister is right in saying that crime is a really big concern to people, and it's not altogether unconnected with social conditions. Dennis Skinner, who was an old miner, made a speech years ago in Chesterfield when I was the member. He said, when I left school at 16, there were 3 pits I could work in, or 2 building sites, and nobody locked their front door. Now everybody locks their front door, and an unemployed kid kicks it in and pinches their video. There is a relationship between crime and social prospects of employment. That doesn't excuse anybody who does it. So you do, I think the Prime Minister himself said you have to deal with crime and the causes of crime. I haven't studied the new bill. Has it been published? Probably not yet, but the outline was in the paper today. And I think when you look at these things, you do have to balance the need for dealing with criminals to safeguard society with the importance to all of us of civil liberties and a proper respect for that. Because an emergency can be used to take away your civil liberties. Look at America. They've got all these guys in Guantanamo Bay who they say are al-Qaeda suspects. They've never been charged. They've been in prison for a year. And, you know, have the al-Qaeda won in persuading America to give up their civil liberties? I mean, it's quite a serious threat. And there's an element of that here, too. So that's my approach to it. But I can't give you a more measured judgment because I haven't seen the proposals in detail. But I think it's a very important question to ask. Right, now is there another woman?
Mr. Benn, I would like to ask you this question. Sir Winston Churchill once warned us, those of us who have got grey hairs enough to remember, that there could possibly be a third world war. Would you think or suggest perhaps post 9/11 that in the form of terrorism we might be approaching that third world war?
Well, Churchill warned about a third world war. Indeed, the first time I ever went to the House of Commons in 1937, when I was 12, I heard Churchill speaking about the Nazi menace. This was when he was out of office, and the government of the day was really appeasing Hitler and supporting him, and he warned that. And I think with the weapons at our disposal, I'm talking about the human race, the possibility that this thing could develop and escalate can't be ruled out of account. That's why the words of the UN, you know, we've got to find ways of doing it. There's a quote, I had it in my bag, and it's rather an interesting one. This is the Constitution of the Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization of the UN. And this is what it says: the governments of the states declare that since wars begin in the minds of men, it is in the minds of men the defenses of peace must be constructed. The ignorance of each other's ways and lives has been a common cause throughout history of mankind for the suspicion and mistrust between the peoples of the world through which their differences are broken into war. Now that's a historic statement, isn't it? Because it bears on the question of Islam and Christianity and Judaism. And I collect these things because it helps me. I came across a statement made by a Republican president in the United States, not this one. And this is what he said. He said, "A nation's hope of lasting peace cannot be firmly based on any race in armaments, but rather upon just relations and honest understanding of other nations." That was President Eisenhower. I mean, not all Republican presidents are like Bush. And that man fought in the First World War as Lieutenant Colonel and Supreme Commander in the Second World War. And as I mentioned, soldiers don't like war. They always want it. They regard it as a failure of diplomacy. So if we are going to do it, we do have, I think, to look afresh at what is the cause of war. And when you think that, I think 500 billionaires in the world, fewer than we have here, have got the same income as half the population of the world put together. It's hard to imagine you can live in peace in those circumstances. There has to be a greater equality. People dying of hunger and starvation. Indeed, forgive me if I do it again, but this is what Eisenhower said. He said, every gun that's made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies in the final sense a theft from those who hunger are not fed, those who cold and are not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone, said Eisenhower. It's spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hopes of its children. Now, I know this may sound rather visionary, but without some vision as to what you're at, what's it all about? I mean, why are we interested in any of this? I've got 10 grandchildren. I've got up my age. I don't want anything. If I'd known what fun it was to be 70, I'd have done it years ago. But I worry about my children. And everyone here who've got children already, worry about it. We've got to find an answer, and whipping it up. Oh, we'll bomb them, we'll give them hell, we'll teach them a lesson. All that language is something that I think makes it worse. Because in some ways you could argue war, all war is a form of terrorism, in that innocent people are killed in pursuit of a political objective. I wish I could pull out an answer that resolve the problem, but that really must be what we are working on all the time. Otherwise, we are betraying our trust to our grandchildren. Now, are there any... Right.
Mr. Benn, you've said some very damning things about the way we're represented in Parliament, and you've also said that you don't give up hope. Given that you're not a member of the new Labour Party, who will you be voting for at the next general election?
Oh, well, I shall vote Labour, because I think in politics you have to have unity in a political struggle as in an industrial struggle. And I mentioned what the Labour Party is like. I've seen the Labour Party swing from left to right so many times. I'm not trying to persuade you, but I'm just answering your question, what will I do? And you see, if you look at how progress is made, I mentioned this earlier, I mean, how did the trade unions get organised? Well, they did it themselves. I mean, the agricultural workers were weak when they talked to their farmers, so they got together. That was illegal, obviously, in 1830. So they took them to Dorchester Magistrates' Court and sent them to Australia as convicts to punish them for forming a trade union. I've got an American friend, he's just been in Australia. I said, how'd you get on? Oh, he said, Tony, they're great people, but by God, they're very difficult. So I said, what do you mean? Well, they asked me when I applied for a visa if I'd had a criminal conviction, and I said, no, is it still required? Now, and when the trade unions are organised, then they wanted the vote, so then you got the campaign for the franchise. Then the women won. How did the women get the vote? Mr. Asquith, the Prime Minister, Liberal Prime Minister, said if women get the vote, it'll undermine parliamentary democracy. Fancy that, 1912, 13 years before I was born. Women trained themselves to the railings, they went to prison, they went on hunger strike, they were forcibly fed, and the men capitulated. How did apartheid end? I mean, if we'd asked me a question 40 years ago about apartheid, you might have said, well, Tony Mandela's in jail, the whites own the farms, they own the factories, they own the media, they run the police, they run the army, and so on. And yet it happened. And so I do think that organisation is, you know, we have to, if we want something done, we have to do it ourselves. And this idea some kind king or prime minister will pat you on the head and say, leave it to me, is not democracy. Democracy is what we do where we live and work, and not what somebody will do to us if we give them a vote. So it's a different view. It's a sort of bottom-up view of politics. And all that I've ever learned confirms that view, I think. I mean, take the environmental movement. You remember Swampy? A few years ago, Swampy was widely denounced as a bearded weirdie who would be taken into custody by the constable. Now, in a couple of years, he'll be in the House of Lords because the environmental argument is won. Everybody knows the environment matters now. Prime Minister can't make a speech without mentioning Kyoto because the argument has got from the bottom to the top. So don't be depressed, although I admit it's difficult sometimes to be cheerful. Now, should we have we had... Right.
What would you do with the American situation and the amount of money that we still owe the Americans from the war? I think we owe some sort of 135 million, which is due to be repaid by 2006. This was the aftermath of the Lend-Lease aid that we received from the Americans. Would you argue against repaying it or renegotiate it at this stage in the light of our Anglo-American relations?
Well, our relations with the Americans are very interesting. After all, George Washington was the first terrorist. The American colonies were quite happily governed by King George III, who, as we all know, is a very good king, they all are. And George Washington took to arms and destroyed the British Empire, and America became independent. I'm making fun of it, but actually, in modern terms, he would have been seen in that way. Now, America is a very close ally, but if you have a close friend, you don't necessarily subordinate yourself to what you want. So I'll give you a few examples. The day I was elected to Parliament, which nobody would forget the first time, November the 30th, 1950, President Truman, the American president, said he might drop an atomic bomb in the Korean War. I didn't notice it because I was so busy, but I heard it later. Attlee, the Labour Prime Minister, flew straight to Washington and stopped it. That was one example of a British Prime Minister telling an American not to do it. A few years later, when Anthony Eden, the British Conservative Prime Minister, made war on Egypt, Eisenhower, whom I just quoted, he stopped it. And Eden collapsed, was defeated, and replaced by the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Harold Macmillan. A few years after that, when President Lyndon Johnson was fighting a war in Korea, he tried to persuade Harold Wilson to send British troops to Vietnam. He tried to persuade Harold Wilson to send British troops to Vietnam, and Harold wouldn't do it. And I think you owe a friend the truth. And I think what Bush is doing is not only wrong, but is desperately dangerous, coming back to the question, could it trigger off a world war? And Islam, you know, is an influential, important group of people in the world. And if they thought it was a religious war, God knows what would happen. So I think that's what we should do. We should speak our mind as friends to the Americans. Don't forget there are millions of Americans against the war as well. And we should be working with them, and I do the best I can to keep in touch with the American peace movement. And they have big demonstrations. They're not reported in the papers here because, you know, they haven't thrown a brick through McDonald's, but it's there. And I think a lot of Americans, even today, wouldn't want to go to war unless Mr. Blair supported them. And so the British contribution to this war isn't military. I mean, our military contribution is minuscule compared to the American. But what they want is political cover from Britain. And if we withdrew that political cover, they might think again about the war. These are all very difficult questions, but there's so much, if I must say so, the discussion we're having tonight is so much better than Newsnight. I happily stay in Dorking and join with you whenever required. Now, there was, that's you, and this is the last question, so make it really difficult.
Mr. Benn, I'm a distraught commuter from Dorking. How can we renationalise our railways?
How what?
How can we renationalise our railway system?
Well, I mean, I think our railways may have been partly renationalised because they've all gone bankrupt. I mean, Railtrack went bankrupt. And so actually it was brought into what they call public administration and is now a non-profit company. But this is the funny thing about public ownership. At the end of the war, the railways were absolutely bankrupt. And partly competition from the roads and the lack of investment, and they were brought into public ownership, re-equipped. And then when they were looked as if they might make a profit, they were all sold off. The pits were re-equipped after the war. Everything had fallen into disrepute. And now I do feel that people would welcome that. Well, I looked it up the other day because I was interested in it. As you know, the government gives subsidies to the railway companies. Many of them run the services at a loss, but also the taxpayers' contribution pays the dividends to the shareholders of the companies who run it at a loss. I mean, it's crazy. And having said all that, I've always felt about public ownership that you don't just want to change the name on the door and have what's sometimes called state capitalism. I'm a great believer that if you work in a service, you should have a greater say in how it's run than just bringing in the consultants. I mean, I think people probably best know how to run hospitals are the people, the consultants, the porters, the nurses, and all that. And so I do believe that we've missed a bit of a trick on this, that industrial democracy where you tap the genius of the people there, is something we've missed. And there's such talent about to bring it to bear. So I'm not just in favour of nationalisation and having a state-run company. I think we've got to do it a bit more intelligent than that. Because I mentioned it earlier, I say it again, I do think the level of intelligence in this country is so much higher than people get the credit for. And the parties are just as bad. I'll finish with this story. When I was an MP, I used to get a fax every day from the Millbank Tower, which was the Labour Party headquarters. And they had people there drafting press releases for everybody, including me. And my fax would start clacking away, and I'd read it as it came out. It said, Tony Benn welcomes. I didn't know what I'd welcomed, of course, at that particular moment. And it would be some gimmick like compulsory homework for pensioners or something, and it would come out, Tony Benn welcome. And I was expected to take it out of the fax machine, pop it back to the Derbyshire Times, who were then supposed to print Tony Benn welcomes. And I made a speech saying, I'm feeling less and less like a member of Parliament and more like an Avon lady who's told what to say when she knocks at the door. And believe it or not, I got a furious letter from the managing director of Avon, said, how dare you compare Avon ladies with members of Parliament? And you know, we've got to think for ourselves, haven't we? And when you think of the internet, of better education, of the communication, of everything, people nowadays are just, I mean, children are unbelievably informed about the world. And so democracy does depend on a recognition of the talent, not just in the educational system, but throughout life. People are, well, there's good and bad, but they're a pretty shrewd bunch. And that's one reason why I was so keen to recreate the public meeting. The biggest public meeting I ever addressed in my life was in Bombay in 1960. And Nehru was there on the platform, a 40-foot platform, took me ages to climb up. And there were 400,000 people there. And they said to me afterwards, sorry it was a small meeting, but it wasn't a public holiday. And Mr. Gladstone, you see, he went round in the Midlothian campaign and addressed meetings of 5,000 and 6,000 people. I gave a lecture in honour of Gladstone the other day, and I looked it all up. And he began one speech by saying, as this old man in his 70s, he said, I come to you unmuzzled. And that's how I feel tonight. And you've been very patient, and thank you for coming. And I hope you had a nice evening.